This is The Neutral Position, hosted by Nick Palmisano, bringing honesty and reason back into conversation. Here's your host, Nick Palmisano.
I am incredibly excited to have Jennifer Griffin on tonight. You know her from Fox News. You know her from some of the greatest interviews in history. And Jennifer, tell us about yourself.
Oh my gosh, Nick, thank you. First of all, Chief National Security Correspondent, Fox News. I've been at the Pentagon for 15 years. I was overseas for about 16 years before that, covered a lot of conflicts. My husband's a journalist. We started this journey when I was 20 years old. We met in South Africa. And I've just, had a front row seat to history ever since.
I want to say how interesting your family is to me, because you are a very intense person. You walk into a room, everybody instantly knows you're in the room. And I meet your husband casually in a war zone in Ukraine. And he is...
That's his happy place, by the way.
He is so low key.
Yeah.
I also feel like bombs could be exploding in the background,
Totally.
And he would still be like, hey, it's really nice to meet you.
Totally.
And just...
You know what's funny about Greg? So Greg Myrie, he's my husband. He was with AP for 20 years. He was with the New York Times when we were in Jerusalem and covering the Intifada. And now he's with NPR. And he spent twice he went for 7 weeks last year to Ukraine. So he spent a long time in Ukraine. And I say to people will say, are you worried? Are you scared? And I was be like, no, he's happy. This is his happy place. When he's up close to the front lines, reporting on conflict, Greg has the personality. There's a funny story about when he came back from Ukraine last time, and I don't mean to make fun of our organizations being concerned about the psychological health of their workforce, but they wanted him to talk to a psychologist and see if he had PTSD or if he had trauma or anything. And they had allotted an hour's time. And Greg is really, ever since I've known him, he is just steady Eddie. He does not take in he does not go high, he does not go low.
Yeah.
He's the same guy that I met when I was 20 years old, and that was 30 years ago. But after 5 minutes of talking to the psychologist, he was giving them stats about how many murders had taken place in D.C. while he was gone and comparing them to Ukraine in Kyiv and how Kyiv was really safer than D.C. After 5 minutes, the psychologist said, well, I think we're done. You seem okay. You seem okay. And he just, I laugh because that's Greg. He really doesn't take in the stress. And my kids call me, we have 3 kids together, and when we were based in Jerusalem, I had to leave the day after Christmas to cover the tsunami, if you remember, back in in Thailand, and it was very dramatic, and it was horrible.
Yeah.
Nick, it was so bad. That was one of the worst stories I'd covered because, there were literally bodies in the trees when I arrived, because we got there so quickly from Israel, and. So my kids call me Mommy Tsunami because when I come in to the house after a long day, I throw things into disarray, then I leave again, and Greg is there steady.
This is not a normal career, especially your version of the career has been, really wild. You've been everywhere and done everything. How do you get into this? How do you end up on this journey?
Well, it wasn't planned, I can tell you that much. And I would say, so I was in college. I was a normal university student. I was at Harvard, and I met a visiting professor. There was a journalist from South Africa, an editor. He was the editor of the main black newspaper in the country called The Sowetan. Yeah. And apartheid was still in place. It was the 80s. Mandela was still in prison on Robben Island. And we had coffee, and he said, why don't you come to South Africa? You can work at the Sowetan. You can, I was working on the school newspaper, the Crimson. And so it just sounded like a great adventure. I thought I was going for 6 months, maybe a year. I was going to live with a family and just go see what was going on. But I really didn't have a plan. And so when I arrived, things were kind of crazy in South Africa. There was a lot of violence in the townships. There was the tension, little fighting between the ANC and Kata. People were getting necklaced in the townships. And I started traveling around with some war photographers, going out in the morning, going on as they looked for sort of news stories. And, these were some really good photographers. They ended up winning Pulitzer Prizes for the work they did. Greg Marinovich, won a Pulitzer for a necklacing series that was really dramatic. He suffered tremendously, I think, psychologically after that. We talked a lot about that at the time. And then there were other war photographers who were there at the time who were sort of cutting their teeth. They were young. And they ended up writing a book about their experience, and they called themselves the Bang Bang Club. And then there was a Hollywood movie made about them. But I mean, those were my sort of friends when I was 20 years old. I met my husband, Greg, who was, he was older. He was already working for the AP and had a job, and I was just a student. And we met in Soccer City in a full stadium at the first legal ANC rally before Mandela was released from prison. I was there the day that Mandela walked out of prison in Cape Town. That was my first news story. And after that, I was hooked. It was like, it was like a drug.
That's an amazing start to a career. I mean, that was like an incredible moment in history.
It was.
And, I've spent some time in South Africa, and Cape Town is one of the most beautiful places in the world. And,
so beautiful.
Looking off Table Mountain, looking to where kind of that green water and the blue water connect, but then right behind it is, Soweto and just all of the
juxtaposition. I mean, I think what I learned, and this goes back, and this is something I've carried with me for 30 years. I learned a lot about bias, and I learned a lot about making assumptions and viewing things through a certain lens, or seeing that maybe it was a really interesting time because there were some journalists there who were really activists more than journalists.
Yep.
And then there was an older cadre of reporters, a lot of them print reporters who worked for the Washington Post. And this was sort of still the heyday of foreign correspondence, when newspapers still had foreign correspondents. They had big bureaus. They put a lot of money into, the CBS bureau. They had excellent, really iconic foreign correspondents. And so then you had the older group of journalists who really, many of them had been in Vietnam and had covered all the conflicts since Vietnam. And I just learned so much sitting around the dinner table and the bars and listening to their stories, and starting to differentiate between what kind of journalist did I want to be, who did I respect, and how did they try to navigate this world of activist journalists versus those who really tried to present all sides in a fair manner. And it's been a long road. It's been 30 years. I think we've seen journalism change a lot in that time frame. And I've witnessed it. I've been a part of it. And, but I'm pretty proud of the journey that I've had, but it wasn't planned at all.
Well, those are usually the best trips, right? You brought up something, though, that I wanted to ask you about. Journalism has changed, probably mostly because of the medium and the speed with which information comes at us. You were extremely well respected, even when people have come at you in the past. You've had people from both sides of the aisle saying,
"That means I'm doing my job.
Hey, this is not fair. She's objective. She doesn't mess around." I remember a couple of incidents where people have come at you. But I think that my impression, and I could be wrong because I'm not an expert, is that that more and more journalists are playing fast and loose with information because they are racing to get a story out.
Well, I think it's the nature of the way the business has changed. I mean, when I started, First of all, let's remember there was no internet. There were no cell phones. We had beepers that we carried. We faxed.
Which was very fancy.
And I didn't even have a beeper because I was just a freelancer. But the beeper would go off all night long, and we'd get mad at the journalists who would send out happy birthday announcements in the middle of the night because it was supposed to be for breaking news. I faxed my stories. When Greg and I went to Somalia, I mean, you ask how I got into this business. When I had to go back and graduate from Harvard. And when I did finally graduate, my dad gave me a little bit of money for graduation. I think it was like $1,500. And that was supposed to last me for the year and get me started as a freelancer. And so I went back to South Africa where Greg, my boyfriend, was. And when I arrived, we had been dating long distance for 2 years. When I arrived, he said, "Oh, great, you're here. Just wait. I'll be back." And he was with AP, and they had assigned him to go to Somalia. It was the summer of 1992, full famine in full force. Again, no cell phones, no way to communicate. Sat phones, if you're lucky, you could borrow a UNICEF or ICRC, Red Cross sat phone. And so he took off for Somalia, and I'm sitting there in South Africa thinking, what am I going to do? And being somewhat hot-headed, and now I'm the ripe age of 22, I decided to take all that money that my dad gave me for graduation, and I bought a ticket to Nairobi, which was the only place that planes were flying into Mogadishu. They were little kind of puddle jumper planes that, the area, the movie Out of Africa.
Yes.
Karen Blixen had a house outside of Nairobi, and just near there was a little airport for these sort of small planes that were flying into Mogadishu. And it's also the same airport where the khat dealers, the drug dealers, were flying the drug that they love to chew into Somalia at the height of the famine. And so they were taking accredited journalists on UNICEF planes, but I couldn't get on a UNICEF plane because all I had was my Harvard ID and wasn't a journalist.
Please tell me that you rode on the drug dealer
I
plane.
went to negotiate. I was told that I could pay my weight in khat.
Oh my
and
God.
so I'm negotiating with the drug dealers, and they're ready to take me. But, I'm 5'10", so it was going to be a pricey ride with the khat dealers. And then a Canadian journalist grabbed me and said there was an extra seat on the UNICEF flight. So we flew in, did a corkscrew landing, and there was no at that point, Greg didn't know I was coming. He was using this is how long ago it was and how different journalism was. He was using a manual typewriter that was handed to him by his bureau chief in Nairobi, and he said, "Yeah, it worked for me." And so I show up at the UNICEF house in Mogadishu, and he was a little surprised. And then we started. It was
Jennifer,
AP.
That's crazy, right?
No, that's just. You asked me how I got started, and oh, by the way, my parents didn't know anything of what I was doing.
Of course they didn't.
And this was the beauty of being a journalist then. You could go places. Nobody was taking selfies. Nobody had cell phones. Nobody had. You could disappear and tell stories, and people, when look, it was a crazy time in Mogadishu. All those technicals and people with guns, and we hired, guards to take us around, and it was dangerous, but you didn't feel like you were a target. And that's what changed over time for journalists like us, is that after Daniel Pearl was beheaded, after Sarajevo, when bounties were put on the head of journalists, after ISIS began beheading journalists like Jim Foley on camera for propaganda purposes, that changed the whole landscape. So things we did when we felt like we were, protected in some ways. It was dangerous, but as long as you used some judgment, there were calculated risks. But there were not many journalists there that summer. We did a lot of stories on the famine, and about 6 months later, that's when the Marines were sent in, and then you remember Black Hawk Down. That was
that happened right after I got accepted to West Point.
Oh yeah.
So that was top of mind.
Yeah.
A young man, with all the arrogance and fire and brimstone. In the back of my head, it was like, we're going to get them back for what they did kind of thing. That was, that was a very emotional time. Like I remember the Delta guys, getting dragged through the streets.
Oh, no. And not just the military, but journalists were killed there. There was a young, Dan Eldon was a young, very promising journalist who was working with Reuters. And, we still have a T-shirt that he made. He was making silkscreen T-shirts at the time, and Greg still has the T-shirt. As the type of guy he is, for 30 years he can keep the same T-shirt. Yeah. But it had a silkscreen of a sort of a red line through an AK-47, and it said, "Thank you for not looting." And that was a kind of young sort of tongue-in-cheek, dark humor that you have in war zones. And
but you haven't stopped though. Like you have achieved a very high status in life.
I'm not going to say that I do not still cover wars in the same way that we did when we were young. I took a decision probably around the 2007 timeframe when we moved back from the Middle East, and we had two young daughters. They were 6 and 8 at the time, and I took a decision. And then that was before my son was born. And I took a decision that we had rolled the dice a number of times, and we had enough friends who had been either injured or killed that one of my proudest things. You talk about how journalism has changed. There aren't a lot of people who survive the stresses of 30 years of the kind of intense reporting that we've done and the places we've been. I'm very proud that I'm still married to the same man. I managed to have 3 children, and still I'm doing the job that I love. I'm doing it from the Pentagon. It's not exactly unsafe there, but it is.
It's probably more dangerous.
Well, Washington is really dangerous, but the landmines are much more unexpected in Washington. The war zone I like because you at least know who the enemy is.
The Kevlar in the back.
You at least you have a flak jacket on. But truly, but I would say it's a full body contact sport. I grew up playing sports, and I come home and I feel like I've played rugby. It's physical when you sort of chasing a story, going on air. It's a very intense. From the moment I wake up, like many people, this is high stakes. And you talked about whether it's there are people out there. I don't like to think that people are out there trying to get stories wrong. They're not. It's just the pace at which we're expected to confirm things, to get facts right, to not make mistakes. I mean, every day is a high wire act.
Do you feel, as a real journalist, do you feel that you're competing with the newstainment industry?
So I feel what's changed for me is I feel like I'm competing against disinformation. So I'm not looking to my right or left and thinking of other journalists that I'm trying to beat per se. I'm trying to make sure we get the story right. And honestly, that's taking more and more effort because of the information space and the way that our enemies have realized how to use the information space to manipulate all of us, the American people, journalists, our government. And so that really it's like a multifaceted Rubik's Cube every day that we're doing. And so I feel that what I'm competing against is, am I being lied to, used for disinformation purposes? What's coming through social media that how am I going to get tripped up by something that may have no basis in reality? That is scary. And so that's what I live in fear of every day. I actually see, and I said this to one of my colleagues who you would expect me to be competing against at the Pentagon. One of the other networks has a new young reporter on the beat. And I said, welcome. And oh, by the way, we all started here once. I'm the JV person on the beat. There are people who have been there. David Martin from CBS have been there for 30 years. Barbara Starr just retired, but she had been there for almost 30 years. The Pentagon is an unusual beat where people stay a long time. And one of the interesting things about being on a beat for that long, there are dangers. There are dangers of getting too close to your subject, to inside the in the weeds but I think if you've spent time in the field and then you've spent a lot of time in the Pentagon building relationships with people as they move through the military and rise up, those relationships are built on trust. I have to walk in the building every day and I have to look people in the eye that I'm reporting on. It's much different when people are just lobbing accusations at leaders and they don't have to look them in the eye the next day, and they don't have to account for whether they got a story wrong, misquoted somebody. I have to account for that every day, and I think that's a good thing. And so I think that I said to this young reporter, I said, look, we all started here once, and it's like drinking from a fire hose. So I played sports. It's sportsmanlike to help your opponent and then go out and compete and beat them.
Yeah.
You don't want to. I don't need an unfair advantage of 15 years of being on the beat. I'd rather help that young person get up to speed, tell her what I know in terms of the way things work in the Pentagon, and then it's more fun to go out and compete against that person. So I think for the American people, having a strong Pentagon press corps, I'd much rather see good reporters out there. I mean, when we're in a gaggle like we were today after a briefing on the Chinese spy balloon, and we're talking to the briefers afterwards, I love learning from all the other reporters and all the other questions that they're asking. That makes me sharper. That makes me better. That makes me think of more questions. So I do think there's a value to the press corps and the camaraderie. You know, they're rules of the game. And the people who don't get that are maybe the bloggers who haven't been in a press corps, or maybe a person who's sitting on the air and has never met the source of who they're talking about. It's very easy to tear things down. It's much more difficult to try and figure out what's actually going on.
Do you even think about the bloggers? I mean, because some of these people have
some bloggers are excellent, by the way.
Huge audiences.
Yes. I mean, it depends who you're talking about. I mean, again, on my beat, there are military bloggers who are excellent. So I take information. You know, I kind of feel like when I go into the Pentagon and I sit in my small booth, when I close the door, I mean, my booth is about the size of this table. And I sit with my producer, and she's like a wingman to me, and we navigate the building, and we run and gun together, and we work the phones. We walk down the hall and talk to people in person. We gather information. But I have many streams of information coming in. I sometimes say to, I've met people who fly drones, and they're bringing in lots of feeds, and they're having to collate that and know whether they're going to target something. It's very similar. We are very similar to the NMCC in our booth, the National Military Command Center in the basement of the Pentagon, where they're bringing in all sorts of information. It's what Fox pays me for is 30 years of experience in the field, overseas, in the building, with sources, to be able to sort of quickly understand what information's coming at me, what sounds true, what's not true, how do you do that in real time? It's like, I mean,
those are fast decisions.
They are fast decisions.
Yeah.
I don't always get it right, but that's what they're paying for, and that's why being on the beat actually is a benefit, I think, at this point in time.
That's super interesting. I can't imagine. I mean, because I know how you operate from a very distant perspective, but I mean, I have to think you have hundreds, if not thousands, of messages coming in a day with information to you personally, and your team.
And I try to answer
more.
all of them. That's another thing. I do actually try, but I often feel like if I don't answer this right away, sometimes it makes my family crazy, and they say, "Mom, get off the phone." But sometimes I feel like if I don't answer right away, it's like things will pile up, and so I'm always it does lead to a sort of hypervigilance state that can drain you. And so I try in the morning, to get up and go and exercise. I do Pilates, and I try to just clear my head for at least 45 minutes or an hour before I start the day. Even if my day is started at 6 a.m., I try to get a little exercise before I enter the Pentagon, just because that's the only way to sort of calm that where your brain is just always going.
You mentioned something that I thought was really interesting, in that you have to report on people that you literally are seeing every day.
Sure.
And I've got to think at least 40% of the time it's unflattering.
Well, what I would say is, again, I really believe in the old Tim Russert rule of, be tough with your questions, ask. You can be tough but civil, and I think that's what's often lost. And I think it's not that. I mean, these are human beings that you're covering, and they make mistakes.
Of course,
they maybe haven't thought of something, and so if you ask a question, it may elicit, it. But these are people, and it's hard to take the human element out of it when you are covering a story. I don't care if it's City Hall or the police department or foreign leaders. These are human beings. So let's start with that. We are human beings. We don't get everything right. We're not perfect.
Of course.
And we don't have perfect knowledge, and nor do our leaders. And what I have learned so much in the last 15 years is what I try to learn every day is really the process through which decisions are made. And so how is it that when a Chinese spy balloon shows up on your horizon, what does that trigger? What I want to understand, instead of people just starting with, why didn't you shoot it down? Why didn't you shoot it down? Those are such emotional, childish, immediate responses. I want to know who saw it, was it reported to? You start a game of 20 questions. Is it bigger than a bread box? Is it smaller? And then you start figuring out, and when you start asking questions and you're wrong, that's when you find that your sources, and you have many sources that you're asking, start saying, no, actually it was this way. And that's when you start learning. And so you start piecing together a picture. It doesn't happen instantly. You don't get the answer. They don't just hand you the answer. You start putting together a matrix of information. It's called gathering thread, gathering yarn on a story. And sometimes you have more time than others to do that. But I want to understand. I try to think of, it's almost like a detective going through the story. Instead of simply asking a gotcha question, which may feel good for a minute, I'm not sure that's informing people. I really want to understand how this happened. What did you know? When did you know it? And in the process of that, there's a lot of nuance. And unfortunately, television and reporting these days doesn't do nuance really well.
Terribly, yeah.
And so a lot gets lost in the noise. And it's my job, and one of the reasons, I really believe, and this goes back to when I started in journalism, one of my first jobs in broadcast was for Voice of America. And Voice of America, funnily enough, it was seen as sort of a propaganda arm of the U.S. government. When we lived in Pakistan, we were covering Afghanistan. This was in the early 90s. Ironically, the editing that I had by editors at VOA was much tougher than anything I've ever had since for newspapers, for ABC, who I worked for in Moscow, or for Fox. Those editors were stripping out all the time any adjectives, because adjectives can be opinions. It was a really lean way of writing copy. And anytime you said something, they said attribute it. Who said it? Attribute it, attribute it, attribute it. It was such good training for a young journalist to just have the 101 hammered into you. And I try to remember those lessons from way back when I'm putting together a script. How do I know it? Who said it? How do they know it? Maybe they're wrong, but I'm going to quote them. It's very, there is an art to this, and there is, you try to go through sort of good practices. And I think, again, I'm constantly every day trying to strip out any sort of opinion. I'm not perfect, and the absence of what you include in a story can also lead a viewer.
Of course.
So there's lots of ways to lead a viewer, and I'm just always trying to talk to my producer and say, are we being fair here? Is it fair? What's the other side? What am I missing? And it's that editing process that I think gets lost a lot now in journalism, and so. But I really try to tell people what I don't know. Also, I think it's really important to say we just don't know, and often our leaders don't know certain things. They don't have perfect knowledge, and I think that's really hard for people to understand.
With that in mind, right now, confidence in the government, politicians is at a pretty significant low. I think it's the
Horrible.
lowest since the 60s or something like that.
Probably lower. Yeah. And all
how
our
do you-
institutions, by the way.
And all our, even the
it's
military
terrible.
is down
Yeah,
since
horrible.
the withdrawal from Afghanistan
Yeah.
has dropped from the low 90s to the 70s,
I
which
mean,
is
just
which is
crazy.
brutal. But specific to politicians, specific to some of the bigger name military leaders, you work with these people. You see them on a daily basis. America thinks essentially they're all garbage, and we can't trust them. And
That's really a
they are
shame.
trying to, and that they're trying to undermine kind of the American people.
I wish they could spend a day with me in the Pentagon, or it's not to say that these people don't make mistakes. People make mistakes. They also get overruled. And the military is a complicated place because you don't get to just make up the rules, and you don't get to overrule the civilian order unless it's illegal. And so it's a complicated system. I wish people could, and it's not just the military, but let's just use the military since that's my sort of day in, day out life right now. I wish they could spend time with these senior leaders that maybe have become sort of caricatures or memes on the internet and through social media. First of all, I think a lot of those memes are elevated and amplified by our enemies.
100%.
Because
Yep.
what would Russia or China or Iran or North Korea really like to do right now? They'd like to discredit the U.S. military. They'd like to drive a wedge between the enlisted and the officer class. So what have we seen happen over the years? A lot of the memes and a lot of the things are designed to divide us, whether we're as a country or a military, and journalists. I mean, they're tearing down journalists all the time. So I'm not saying there's not real criticism or even fair criticism. Criticism is good. That's what the First Amendment is based on. That's what this country is based on. And but what used to happen with free speech and difference of opinions is we would keep them civilized. I was with a British Parliament member tonight who is the defense. He is in charge of defense for and is providing a lot of the weapons to Ukraine through the British government. But he's a member of Parliament, and he watched our State of the Union the other night, and he said, "Woo." That almost seemed like Question Time in Parliament, which is known for its sort of boisterous, yelling back and forth and challenging the Prime Minister and really questioning the Prime Minister in a very sort of raucous way.
Yeah.
The difference, he said, is in Parliament, in the Parliament system, they're all called the Honourable X. So instead of Congressman, they're the Honourable Parliament and name of Parliament member. And there is a rule. So while it seems crazy and raucous in Question Time, there are actually rules. And one of the rules is that you can't say that someone's lying. You can't impugn the character of another member of Parliament or the Prime Minister. You can question them. You talk around it. You might say, I think the minister might be mistaken or may have misled us unintentionally. But whatever he was saying, but you could never say he's lying or she's lying because you would be impugning their character, and they are technically the Honourable X. So there are still rules of the road in that chaotic Parliament. There are no rules of the road anymore in terms of civility in our country. It's disgusting. The kind of behavior that we see in our Congress, in our media, on air, there used to be rules against saying certain, the kinds of things that we hear people say on a daily basis. It really has debased the ability to debate. Nobody sticks to facts anymore when they debate. They just immediately go to saying hateful things about their enemy. There's no sort of Oxford-style debate where you actually counter people on points and facts and whatever. It gets into the mud so quickly, and it's really brought all of us down. It's debased the media. It's debased politicians. It's led to lack of trust. Now the military is a little hamstrung because the leaders of the military are somewhat muzzled in terms of how they can fight back because they're supposed to take orders from the civilian leadership. And so I see growing frustration that they can't either just explain how a decision was made or what went wrong or why something didn't go the way but people are just vicious in the way they're coming after them. And frankly, they're wrong. I've covered a lot of these stories, and the narratives that are out there are misleading at best. And it's frustrating to me because I think, wait, if I were to explain with facts about how a certain decision is made, why is it that people are still saying why the next day? You know, it's really we're in a kind of post-fact world where people are not open-minded anymore. They don't want to really know.
They want to be right.
They want to be emotional and react, and they are assuming the worst about the people sitting across from them, and it is really tearing this country apart.
I grew up in a household, you can imagine an Italian-Portuguese household where half of my family was very liberal and half of my family was very conservative.
I think that's most families in America.
And they would we'd sit around the dinner table and they would argue. I'm talking argue.
Yeah.
Nonstop for hours. This was my childhood, watching adults argue points. And then at some point, my grandmother or my mom would be like, all right, that's enough. We're having dessert. And then it would just be over and everyone would be friendly.
Yeah.
And now, and sometimes as a 11, 12-year-old entering the fray, sometimes I got embarrassed because it was you know what? My opinion really wasn't backed up. But that was an important lesson too. It's okay to be wrong.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody feels like they can be wrong online anymore.
Everybody doubles down.
They double down.
And nobody says, good point.
Hey, yeah, you were right.
Or I was wrong.
I still do that online. And it actually, people are like, oh, really? Is there they're waiting for the sneak attack or something. And it's not that hard. I mean, we can't be right about everything.
Well, look, I remember there was a story, I can't remember which one it was, but 1 hour I went on and I said something, and then within the next 15 minutes, I realized I had been wrong. And the next hour I went on and I corrected it. How often do you see people do that? And what was so weird to me, because I just thought, well, I've got to correct it. I got a call from the White House, I won't say which White House, saying, hey, thank you. The president was watching and really appreciates that you corrected that. I was like, wait, don't call me. This is normal.
This is what I'm supposed to do.
This should not be such an elevated event. I made a mistake. I owned up to it. We're moving on.
Yeah.
But no, I just see a lot of doubling down, tripling down, and wanting to believe. There used to be a sort of Occam's razor. What's the most logical reason that something happened? That's usually the reason. And we are so prone to conspiracies now, or to believe that there was, all this coordination behind the scenes. The one thing I've learned at the Pentagon and in covering Washington, whether it's at the Capitol Hill or the White House and the way they all interact, is it's often not. You assume everyone's talking. You assume everyone knows what everyone else is doing. Not true. And there's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of chaos. It's like a bad game of telephone on most days. And I usually spend a lot of time just trying to do the forensics either on a story, or debunking something that I know not to be true, and think, how did that go off the rails? How did they get from there to there? It's really always a puzzle.
Do you think the quality of politicians has gone down over the years?
Who would put their family through being in the public eye right now? This is not Mr. Smith Goes to Washington anymore. This is not the era where you had this. I mean, there are still wonderful people, and I hate to impugn the whole political class, just like I won't impugn the whole, all journalists. Everyone could do better. But I think the people that are being attracted to the limelight, whether it's on television or politicians who want to be on television, or there is something, a bit off and slightly narcissistic about
Yeah.
this group that we are now sort of. It's not the. They're not the politicians who we've kind of broken Washington by not allowing politicians who disagree or from different parties to sit down and break bread together.
Yep.
When I was growing up, and I grew up outside of Washington, so I've seen this town through different iterations since I was young. And I worked in, I worked as a page on the Hill. I worked for a lobbyist. So I saw it from all different angles before I was a journalist, but summer jobs and what have you. And I knew families who all had, usually high-level people in government, whether Congress or at the Pentagon or in the White House. Those were the kids I grew up with in our school, for better or worse. And so when you get to know people's parents, because you're just,
You're just a kid.
you're playing tag in their backyard, or you are coming in eating, spaghetti at their dinner table. It's a little different than when you hear these caricatures of these people. But we've broken Washington because people don't sit down from different sides of the aisle and talk to each other anymore and have a meal and go to their, have their kids grow up together.
Yeah.
Everyone races out of Washington, goes back to their home districts and starts bad-mouthing Washington, acting like it's the worst place in the world. What I've learned over the years, Nick, is that private groups are great, volunteer groups are great, NGOs are great, but government and the private sector have to work hand in hand to get anything done. If you want to do anything at scale, you're still going to need the government.
100%.
And so it's really, we can talk more about it, but it's a longer story about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the things that veterans groups did to go in and help. But let's not forget, they didn't do it alone. There were still the 82nd Airborne.
Yeah.
There were still trained Marines who were evacuating those tens of thousands of people.
Of course.
But are we better when veterans groups plus the U.S. government work together and are rowing in the same direction? Of course, just like in Ukraine. We saw it firsthand with the evacuation of Benjamin Hall, my Fox colleague who was injured, and our colleagues Pierre and Sasha, who were killed. That was a situation where the U.S. government could not go in and rescue Benjamin Hall, but NGOs like Save Our Allies and talented, amazing Americans who had great skills thanks to their work with the U.S. military, they were able to team up, and then we got Benjamin across the border into the hands of the 82nd Airborne. The Defense Secretary then authorized that Benjamin be treated for his amputation and in the shrapnel that he had received in his body, and get treated by the best U.S. military doctors, by the government at Landstuhl.
Yeah.
And he's back with his family.
Yeah.
But I get very upset when I hear people just say that government's bad, journalists are bad, politicians are bad. It's tearing us up.
But I think where it comes from is the average American is just generally disappointed with what they see from D.C., right? And I'm not arguing with you. I completely agree with you. I think that, looking at Afghanistan, there is no way that any of that happens without the security that the U.S. government provided. Similarly, though, there's the problem of so many of these Afghans that need evacuation could be instantly solved by the power of the U.S. government. And so, for me, I have incredible frustration with so many things in government. I have incredible frustration with some of the members of Congress that get up and say outlandish things that I know they know they're not true.
Right.
Like, I know
it's all
that
performative.
It is a performance. And unfortunately, there are a number of people that believe those performances. And so we end up with kind of the dumbest imaginable arguments, but they end up leading the way.
And they take up so much airtime. I mean, there's so many important things in the world right now that we should be discussing.
Yeah.
And this, so look, I agree with you, but I guess what I'm not willing to give up on is that I've met really good people who are still trying to do good on Capitol Hill. You're going to interview some of them, I think.
Yeah.
I know really good journalists out there. We wouldn't know about a lot of the things that have had to be fixed in this country without journalists. I mean, when there were no MRAPs for protecting troops in Iraq, that was a USA Today reporter who then Robert Gates, who was Defense Secretary, read the story and said, fix this, get them the MRAPs. What's holding up the MRAPs? And that saved lives. I could give you a million examples of that. I think we need to go a little easy. We need to be critical, but go a little easy on the human beings who are deciding to step up and take on these leadership roles, because this is a pretty ungovernable country right now, and we're in a pretty dangerous information space with great power competition, China, Russia, and they're laughing at us because we're doing more to destroy ourselves than they could ever do to us.
Yeah, if this country falls, it will not be from an outside power. It'll be from our inability to function.
And that has to stop now.
So how would you change that?
Civility. It's so simple. Let's go back to things we learned when we were in kindergarten. Treat your neighbor like you would like to be treated. Listen to people. Don't feel like you're always on attack, and just start by treating people decently. You start by treating each person that you encounter during the day the way you would want to be treated. I mean, it's so basic. And then let's just take that to online. So your online behavior, everyone needs to clean up and think, am I just attacking people because I'm anonymous and they can't get me and can't. So let's lower the temperature, have reasonable debates. I'm not saying you have to agree with everyone who's in power or not be critical and vote them out if they did something wrong. But if you destroy journalists and you say that all journalists are bad and corrupt and that the media is somehow complicit in everything that's going on as opposed to being the watchdog that it's supposed to be, if there's a bad journalist, if they make a mistake, the public should call. If someone publishes something they know not to be true, there should be consequences for that. And there aren't any consequences anymore for anything. There's no accountability, but we have lost our way in terms of, would you let your children behave the way people are behaving right now?
No, absolutely not. Yeah. How do we affect institutions? So me as an individual, it's very easy for me to affect me, which is what we can only control what we can control.
Right.
But we have these institutional problems.
Yeah.
There are a number of journalists that are not good, and maybe they're not part of Fox or CNN or some of the big houses, but they still have audience.
Sure.
They're not good. They have agendas. They're not trying to share the news. They're trying to pitch a narrative.
Right.
We have politicians that are just clowns, but they have huge audiences.
Sure.
How do we combat that from an institutional basis? And I know that's not easy.
It's really hard because, you walk pretty quickly into curtailing free speech. And I battle with this all the time. I sometimes think, well, you're not allowed to yell fire in a theater. Where's the line anymore for where we're inciting people to to violence or to destroy things? I don't know, because I still, in my heart of hearts, believe that the more debate and the more access to facts that people have, the more we'll get closer to the truth, and then it'll crowd out the noise. But the noise is pretty loud right now. And so I'm not sure it's working. And so where's the line, and how do you regulate it? Do you regulate it? People hate being regulated. Our Constitution is pretty sacred. You don't want to be messing with the First Amendment. But people are abusing some of these rights that have been given under the Constitution. I think we're going to have to. I don't know. I don't have the answer. If I did, I'd be writing about it. But it's definitely keeping me up at night.
If there was one thing that you could change, like you were God for a day, you get one wish, but that wish has to be used for improving the United States of America.
Oh, I love this country. It actually makes me sort of like, what could we do if you had one wish?
What would you change with the blink of an eye?
Gosh. I really think, again, not to sound too Pollyannish, but I still believe, I just wish we could sort of take it back, take the temperature down, and get back to civil discourse. I think you can vote people out who you don't like. You don't have to put their heads on pitchforks. You don't have to think about your language. I mean, we just have to get back to some civility. That would be what I would request.
Do you have hope for there's kind of a next emerging class of politicians? I think,
I have a lot of help. I have a lot of faith in young people, by the way. I mentor young people all the time. I see the ones who've come through, who are at universities and come through COVID. I see the ones who are working hard every day, who I see behind counters, who it kind of makes they're a lot smarter than we give them credit for.
Oh, yeah.
And, we complain about them being on their phones. But, a lot of them are learning a lot on those phones, and a lot of them are a lot more tuned into the world than we give them credit for. So I actually think the next generation, I think we've kind of messed things up, and I think we need to be a little more humble as our generation. But I think the young people are pretty switched on.
I think every generation fixes a lot of stuff and then messes up a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And a lot of it has to do with changing technology, right? I was a computer geek when computers came out. Like, I made my first virus in 1992 or 93.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, like, it wasn't anything super bad. We just did it to each other. Like, we had a couple of nerd friends, but you remember when there was no Windows?
Yeah.
When it was just like you had to type in,
Yeah.
It just created infinite files that were randomized letters and then 3 randomized letters after the period.
Wow.
And would fill a hard drive. We'd try to do that to each other.
Yeah.
But from that to all of a sudden there were BBSs where you could talk to people through your computer, and then the internet.
Oh,
and
crazy.
like that was how I grew up, is through this crazy period of time. And now what I thought was a powerful machine pales in comparison to this tiny device that we have access to. And we're, Chat GPT just came out. That's incredibly powerful. That's just the tip of the iceberg. The world's about to change significantly over the next 2-3 years just through AI.
Oh, my goodness.
And we're going to screw that up. I mean, we're going to screw it up.
Yeah.
And so, our generation created all of these things, but our generation also is going to make all the mistakes associated with it.
Right.
To your point, what I do see with this generation, I think they are extremely kind and extremely empathetic. I have like 107 children, as you know, and
I wish I did.
The issues of race that maybe we grew up with, the issues
It's
of...
gotten so complicated. It seemed a lot simpler before. And my kids say, Mom, you just don't know. I was like, no, I know. I went to apartheid South Africa. I actually do know.
I do. I really get it. But they actually, for them, it's a non-issue. Like they're just like, they look at us like...
Yeah, like we're like Neanderthals.
What's wrong with, exactly. Like, what is wrong?
Yeah.
How did your generation have these issues?
Right.
Because it's not a thing for them.
Right.
And I think that's like incredible progress.
Yeah.
And bullying is not what it was when we were around. There's definitely cyberbullying. There's definitely issues there. But it's not what it used to be. There aren't physical altercations all the time. Kids stick up for each other if somebody is mean to them, even if they don't like the kid. It's a very different generation. So for all the knocks on them.
No, they get a lot of knocks, and there are some things that, but again, some good parenting can help them through this. But I think they're actually pretty resilient. And I think COVID actually tested them in ways that we didn't get tested when we were young. And I think they're kind of looking at the world a little differently, knowing that, you can't take anything for granted, and you don't your path isn't necessarily going to be straight. And I actually think look, it really harmed a lot of them, and it set them back. And the mental health issues are extraordinarily huge right now at all levels of our society. But I think it also has strengthened this next generation in some ways.
What do you want for your kids?
Oh, I love my kids. I just want them to be good people. I want them to carry on with the good character that my husband and I have worked really hard to expose them to the world, to introduce them to all different points of view and experiences that they wouldn't necessarily have grown up with. Being involved with the military community has been very profound for my kids because they were young when the bulk of the wounded from Iraq and Afghanistan were coming through Walter Reed. And through friendships and invitations to be up at Walter Reed, they got to spend a lot of time up there, and they're very empathetic kids who really get how complicated this world is. And 2 of them were born in Jerusalem during the Intifada. That was a crazy time. I mean, I was wearing a flak jacket when I had a 9-month belly, and I interviewed suicide bombers when I was pregnant, and really it was crazy times. And one daughter was born just before the Iraq invasion, and when I left the hospital, I was given a gas mask tent for her crib because they were worried Saddam Hussein was going to fire chemical weapons into Israel. These kids grew up. They are. I just want them to keep their values. And I always say to them, every day from here on out, you're building your reputation, and don't do anything to destroy your reputation, because it's very hard to come back from that these days with the unforgiving,
relentless
nature of the social media environment that we live in, and everything's recorded. So I just hold my breath that they can get through these next few years and with their remembering their values, keeping their reputations, not making a mistake. This world is so unforgiving right now. You make one mistake and you're canceled, you're finished, your whole life is derailed. I watch this and I see the mental health toll that's taking on this younger generation, and I just hold my breath that they can just navigate this very complicated landscape.
I have a feeling that they are going to be the generation that kind of blows it all off. Like right now, it's like everything is so critical. You made a mistake.
Right.
I think they're going to be like, yeah, I made a mistake.
The pendulum might come back.
I think it has
people
to.
are going to say.
I think it has
because it's pretty draconian right now in terms of
brutal.
I wouldn't want to be navigating this period as a kid. We all made mistakes. We know what they were, but they weren't documented.
They weren't documented,
and they weren't on the internet.
Turned into memes.
It's horrible, horrible.
Is there anything that you would have liked me to ask you that I have not asked you?
Well, there's so many wonderful friends that you and I both share in common that I could talk about, but. I think the main lesson for me in my life, as I've been on this incredible journey, and there have been some detours. I had breast cancer 6 months after my 3rd child was born, and spent a year fighting that, and it was pretty rough. It was 17 rounds of chemo, and it was a very aggressive form of cancer, and I really wasn't sure how it would end. And so this life, this journey, this ability to tell people stories, I love telling people stories, because every day there's a story that I come across, and through one way or another, I've seen in my lifetime how it actually can change lives, how it actually can help people. And so I'm still, despite, I'm old, I'm hardened.
You're not old.
I've seen a lot of really bad things, and yet I'm still really optimistic about the potential to do good, and the potential that if we all whatever profession we choose, whether it's journalism, politician, military, we all have a way to make this world a little bit better along the way.
I know it's almost cliche now, but look for the helpers. And no matter how bad things are, you talked about, the tsunami. Obviously, you and I have been involved in Afghanistan and Ukraine and all these important moments in time. No matter what, there's somebody running the other direction to go help the people in crisis, and that is always inspiring.
And those are the people I like to shine a light on.
And you do a wonderful job of it.
Thank you, Nick.
We usually ask rapid fire quick questions just
I'm
for
ready.
fun.
I'm ready.
My favorite is always my first.
Uh-oh.
What is the toughest animal that you think you could defeat in hand-to-hand combat?
Tim Kennedy.
Best answer so far. Best answer so far. Oh man!
Did I throw you off?
We might want to just. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on, Jennifer Griffin. Truly an incredible journalist, an incredible person, and I appreciate knowing you. And thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Nick.